The Davante Adams era is over in New York. Cutting Adams is a necessary move for the Jets, and it's a move that shows the challenges the team faces this offseason. We'll break all that down and more today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, March 4th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We have some big news on players who will not be returning to the Jets in 2025, and the biggest of those names is Davante Adams. Adam Schefter of ESPN reports that the Jets will release Adams. Now, this comes as no surprise. Everybody was expecting it. It was really the only move the Jets could make. Adams, kind of under the radar through his people, has been suggesting that he only wants to play with Aaron Rodgers. And if you don't believe that, I mean, look what happened this year with the Las Vegas Raiders, where he essentially forced his way off the team. I mean, you could argue he quit on the Raiders this year because he wanted to come to the Jets and play with Rodgers. So there's a lot to unpack with this move. The first is that it does clear out about $30 million in cap space. Adams was set to count $38 million against the cap. $30 million will be cleared. Adams will have a dead money charge of about $8 million. And that price tag was a big reason the Jets simply could not bring Adams back. It's just way too expensive. And while Adams is still a productive receiver, he's no longer the type of receiver who should command a $38 million cap hit. Adams, he's 32 years old. He's going to be 33 this coming season. And while, again, he's still playing at a high level, he's not the guy he was in Green Bay. He's a smart receiver. He runs really good routes. His game is built to age very well. But you've seen the last couple of years, the production hasn't been quite as high. Yes, you have games like the Jacksonville game where he completely took it over. There's still moments where he can look like the guy he was in Green Bay. But not worth $38 million. You look back on the trade the Jets made, it's just a lesson that, I mean, I don't even know if it's a lesson you should have to learn, because in the moment it happened, it was very difficult to see how this whole thing ended well. The Jets were 2-4, and it came right after the famous Mike Williams red line game where Williams did not run a good route on an interception Aaron Rodgers threw, and Rodgers still should not have thrown the ball. But it was difficult to see how that 2-4 team was a receiver away from a Super Bowl. And what do the Jets do? The Jets trade a third-round pick for a guy who's at best a rental, 31 at the time, turning 32 in the season, and they take on a terrible contract. Like, it'd be one thing if you gave him a third-round pick and you redid the deal and the deal became favorable and Adams was a bargain. You knew he was going to be on the team for a couple of years. They took on a terrible contract, and they left it in a way that Adams had all the leverage, because Adams in 2025 had a $38 million cap hit, which was completely untenable. So essentially, because they left the contract as was, Adams had all the leverage, because Adams knew the Jets could not bring him back at $38 million. So if he didn't want to come back, you just say, I'm not taking a pay cut. You have to cut me. Just a masterclass in horrendous management. And it goes to the owner, Woody Johnson. I was saying earlier today that, as much hate as Woody Johnson gets, this shows you he doesn't get enough hate, because he took on a bad contract and paid a premium for it. It was just, and it, not like in the moment, it seemed like a smart decision. It did not seem like a smart decision. You can go back and listen to the show I did the day the Jets made the trade for Adams. I said that, yeah, of course he helps the team, but he's not going to take the team to the Super Bowl. He's not the missing piece of the puzzle. And the price they paid for him, he had to be the missing piece of the puzzle. Just really, it's not the worst trade in franchise history. I mean, that's probably going to be the Rodgers trade. But Adams was good with the Jets, but the fact he was good and still the trade was such a failure shows you why they never should have made the trade. It was maybe the trade that had the least upside at the time it was made, because even if Adams was really good, and even if Adams was a 1,000-yard receiver, which he was, it still wasn't worth it to the team. So the Jets create cap space, and they had to do this because this takes them, and Jason from Over the Cap, which is the leading salary cap website on the internet, noted that the Jets go from $22 million in cap space to $52 million in cap space. So it creates a ton of cap space, and the Jets really don't have many other mechanisms to create cap space this offseason. There's really there are only two players whose departure frees up even $5 billion. Adams was one of them at $30 million. So this was it was a move that had to be made. I know some people out there saying, well, we're worse at receiver. Yeah, we're worse at receiver, but like you can't pay this guy $38 million. That the extra $30 million can be used on multiple players who can have cumulatively a bigger impact than Adams. And also, like if the Jets brought Adams back at $38 million, they'd have $22 million in cap space. And the thing is, like, you could look at the $58 million right now, and you could say, well, that's $52 million. That's a lot of money. Well, in the context the Jets are in, it's not really a lot of money because, first of all, you have to remember that the NFL salary cap is going to be $279.2 million. So that's not, that's in that context, $52 million isn't all that much. But you also have to remember the Jets need a quarterback. They need 2 receivers. They're going to need a tight end. And when I say that, they need a right tackle. When I say this, they either need to re-sign the guy who's a free agent at that spot, or they need to find a replacement. So again, a quarterback, 2 wide receivers, a tight end, a right tackle, a starting defensive tackle, probably 2 backup defensive tackles for a rotation. They need an extra defensive end. I know they have Will McDonald and Jermaine Johnson, but really you need 3 defensive ends, a linebacker. I'm assuming, if CJ Mosley's not coming back, a corner, and, maybe a safety or 2. And, $52 million doesn't go that far. And that shows you, when I say the Jets are in a tough cap situation, that's what I mean, because people look at the raw numbers, say $52 million, that's a lot. But in the context of the situation you're in, when the cap is as high as it is, and you have as many needs as you do, it's not a lot. It really doesn't go very far. And that's one of the things that one of the mistakes that gets made in this analysis is people just look at the raw cap figure, but it's partially how much money you have. It's also what you need. And the Jets need an awful lot. And the Jets, there was just no way you could justify Davante Adams at $30 million, because at $30 million, he only fills one of those needs, wide receiver. And he's good. Look, I'm not saying Davante Adams is still not a good player. He's a very good player. He'll probably go somewhere on a much more reasonable contract next year. He could sign with a contender and really help them. If he wants to go with Aaron Rodgers, then I guess, it'll be the him and Rodgers show, and they'll pretty much play out the 2024 Jets season redux. But there was just no way the Jets could afford to bring Adams back. You look at it, even in the moment, it was a really difficult trade to justify. Jets are now out a 3rd-round pick because of it, and they didn't win games. And this goes back to something that keeps getting stated over and over. That there's a segment of the media who are saying the Jets didn't bring Rodgers and Adams back. Now the season's ruined. Jets had Rodgers and Adams last year. The team won 5 games. And, by the way, 2 of those wins came before Adams was acquired. Jets won 3 games with the Aaron Rodgers, Davante Adams combo. And now we're acting like they're the key to the team having success. It's just really tough to believe. I don't have anything against Davante Adams. I thought, he played well when he was here. I thought he played hard when he was here, but he's really just going to be a footnote in franchise history. And most of that footnote will be a cautionary tale in, just bad team management, because the Adams move was like the ultimate in chasing a sunk cost. The Jets had invested so much in the Aaron Rodgers era. At the point it was 2-4, it was clear the team was not going anywhere. And they still threw good money after bad. And that's just something you can't do. And, the Jets paid the price for it. Davante Adams, now a former member of the New York Jets. What else can you say? Well, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to a guy who's been Davante Adams' teammate in 2 stops. That's Alan Lazard. And Jets fans, I think Jets fans will be unanimously happy to hear that. It sounds like Lazard's following Adams out of town. We'll go into more detail on that as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Because with FanDuel, you can place live bets through the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a 4th quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. You'll love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether you're backing your team for a late-game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch 3, you'll never feel like you missed your chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. So much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Davante Adams on his way out of town, and it sounds like Alan Lazard will be following him. Lazard and Adams were teammates with both the Packers and the Jets. Adams is being cut. ESPN's Adam Schefter reports that the Jets have given Lazard permission to seek a trade, and that's the first step in Lazard leaving town. Now, Schefter added to his report that the Jets are quote-unquote open to bringing him back. I think that's a little tough to believe. I think it's something the Jets just said, because if everybody knows that the Jets are cutting Lazard, if they can't trade him, nobody's going to trade for him. Even if you want Lazard, you just wait for him to get cut then, because he's not coming back to the Jets. So I think the Jets are trying to manipulate the media a little bit here, and they're saying, oh, well, yeah, we're open to bringing Lazard back. I don't buy that, because if everybody knows the Jets are going to cut Lazard if they can't trade him, they're not going to be able to trade him. And frankly, despite that report, everybody knows the Jets are going to cut Lazard if they can't trade him. And nobody's going to who would want to trade for Lazard? Darren Muji is a genius if he can figure out some team to take Lazard off his hands, because we've seen Lazard the last 2 years. There are really not many plus skills he's got. About the only positive for Lazard is he has chemistry with Aaron Rodgers. And Aaron Rodgers wants his receivers to read defenses. Sometimes Aaron Rodgers, if he sees a certain thing, wants his receiver to break a route or something like that. And Lazard's good at understanding where Aaron Rodgers wants him to be. That's about the only thing he brings to the table, because he's not fast. He's big, but he doesn't play big. I mean, he does not play with strength. He does not impose his size on defenses. He's not a good contested catch guy. He's not good after the catch. There's really nothing he brings to the table. And when the Jets signed him in 2023, you could go back and listen to that episode. I said this is an Aaron Rodgers tax. I mean, there was no real football rationale for giving Alan Lazard $11 million a year. This was a guy who never had an 800-yard season, a guy who failed to go over 1,000 yards in a year where he was the number one receiver with Aaron Rodgers, and a guy who spent most of his career on a team where Davante Adams was demanding double teams, and there was no other quality number two option. So, and he had Aaron Rodgers as a quarterback. So he had every opportunity to break out and show that he was a quality number two option, and never did. Signing him was all because the Jets were just trying to give Aaron Rodgers whatever he wanted. I don't know how much Aaron Rodgers demanded this stuff, but it was clear the Jets were trying to do everything in their power to make Aaron Rodgers happy. And what followed the last 2 years, it was just terrible. Lazard, he had a couple good games. And it's not he's a guy who can play in the NFL, but he's the type of guy, if you have him at the league minimum and he's your number 4 receiver, you're pretty happy. You're paying him $11 million a year to be your number 2 receiver. You're going to be very disappointed, because they're just not, I don't really know that he's got any plus attributes. I don't know that he does anything better than average. And if the Jets cut him or the Jets trade him, it's another $6.6 million off the salary cap. And this is another reason. There are lots of reasons to not believe that the Jets are actually would ever consider bringing him back. But that's one of the big ones, because as I mentioned earlier, there are only 2 players for the Jets who, again, are pretty tight up against the cap this year when you consider all their needs and when you consider how high the cap is and how much money other teams have to spend. There are only 2 players who create at least $5 million of cap space. One was Davante Adams. The second is Lazard, who saves the Jets $6.6 million if he's cut or if he's traded. Now, of course, you try and trade him first. I mean, there were reports last week that reports a few days ago, the Jets were trying to trade Adams. The problem was that his contract was so bad that Adams would have to agree to a deal with a new team anyway. And if you're gonna have to negotiate with him anyway, why would you trade for him? Why wouldn't you just wait for him to be cut? With Lazard, it's just I think this goes to another level. With Lazard, if you're a team, why would you want to give up a draft pick for somebody like Lazard? Every player has a price. And I think Lazard was actually pretty useful during his tenure with the Green Bay Packers, because he was an undrafted free agent. He was making no money. So if you look at his production with Green Bay, he was making about the league minimum. That was a pretty good result. They got pretty good production from Lazard out of that. But there are a lot of players who are very useful players if you're paying them the league minimum. But these guys become a real liability the second you start paying them real money. And that's one thing the Jets learned, because Jets got a guy who, just doesn't really bring a whole lot to the table. He can't catch the ball. And that's one of the things that was one of the frustrating and surprising things, is for all of his issues, he was never a guy who dropped a ton of passes when he was with the Green Bay Packers. He was not a great receiver. He was not a guy who ever imposed his will on the game, but he could at least catch the ball when it was thrown to him. It's difficult to know what happened with the Jets. I mean, maybe it just he got off to a slow start and all the struggles went to his head or something like that. because look, I don't think he was ever an inspiring receiver, but I think it's clear he was less productive with the Jets than he was in Green Bay. And this is the type of guy, like at the price he's at, if he was actually like a useful player, even despite his ties to Rodgers and despite everything that comes with that, this would be a guy who like you could justify hanging on to as part of a rebuild if he brought more to the table, but he just doesn't bring a whole lot to the table right now. So, what will probably happen is the Jets will spend a couple days trying to find a trade partner, and then once they realize they can't, they'll cut Lazard. They'll get that $6.6 million that can obviously be better spent somewhere else, and they'll turn the page. I'm guessing Lazard's probably going to end up wherever. If Rodgers returns and Adams joins him, maybe they'll reprise that trio. Maybe he'll be with the Giants. Wouldn't it be funny if like Rodgers went to the Giants and essentially like we just saw the exact same season play out again in the same city where you have a desperate GM and a desperate head coach clinging to their jobs, trying to salvage it. So they sign on for this this Green Bay scenario with Rodgers and Adams and Lazard. That'd be pretty funny. And for the results, I suspect would go the exact same way. This was. You talk about lessons learned, and there are lots of lessons from the Davante Adams move. There are also lessons from the Allen Lazard move. And I think one of the big lessons is, in the NFL, there's only so much one player can bring to the table. And when the Jets got Aaron Rodgers, it felt like they just decided that, Aaron Rodgers is the ticket to the Super Bowl. It doesn't matter what else we do. So we can give Allen Lazard $11 million. It's not going to impact us. And it does. When you give Allen Lazard that kind of money, and put him in the type of role that you put him in, you're putting your team in a tough spot. And the Jets saw that. The Jets learned that the hard way. A very disappointing era is coming to an end in New York. I mean, when you talk about all-time Jets free agent busts, there are lots of candidates. You could talk about Trumaine Johnson. We can go down the list. Le'Veon Bell. The incredible number of guys who were, Darrelle Revis' second tenure with the team. Lots of big money deals that did not pan out with the team. So in that context, maybe Allen Lazard's not the worst. But when you look at the amount of money the Jets gave Lazard, when you look at the expectations that they put on this player, and you look at the lack of results, this was a really bad signing. And it was a signing that it's a classic move of signing a guy who's not that good, a guy who may be useful on a league minimum deal, but giving him way too much money, and he's not very useful. And again, a lot of this goes back to the Jets handling the Rodgers situation wrong. Now, during the Locked On Jets podcast, there's one last offensive player who's rumored to be on his way out in New York, and it will open up a bit of a hole for the team. I don't think this player is quite as critical as some of the other guys on offense, but Jets will need to figure out a way to how to replace him. We'll talk about who that is and break it down more as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. The Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. Lots of Jets players on the offensive side of the ball, either on their way out of town or rumored to be on their way out of town. We've talked about Davante Adams. We've talked about Allen Lazard. Now let's talk about Tyler Conklin. Connor Hughes of SNY reports that Tyler Conklin is not expected to return to the team in 2025. Now, Conklin's a free agent, signed a 3-year contract with the team in 2022, coming from Minnesota, and it became something of a fan favorite over the last 3 seasons. I'm not surprised to see the Jets move on from Conklin. Now, it's actually really funny. Like, if you go back, like, Conklin got off to a ridiculous start with the Jets. I mean, he was awful, like, his first month with the team. So I kind of, like, got on him a little bit. After that first month, he turned into an okay tight end. I mean, he's the guy who I don't think has a ton of plus skills. I mean, I think, he's not particularly fast. He's not really a big play threat. He can't really get down the seam. He's also not much of a blocker. What he really was, he was kind of like a check down outlet. And, he caught a lot of passes. He caught a lot of check downs for the team. In 2025, his production went down. I think part of that's Aaron Rodgers liked to go elsewhere when he checked the ball down. Part of it's that, first 2 years with the team, Conklin caught a lot of passes from Zach Wilson on 3rd and 18 that went for 10 yards, or caught passes when the Jets were down 21 points in the fourth quarter. So that maybe helped his production a little bit. Conklin's probably like a median-ish to below median-ish tight end. But I feel like he's the kind of guy who makes a little too much money in free agency. I think if Conklin got a reasonable contract, it wouldn't be a bad deal. It wouldn't be a bad deal to bring him back. If he was on the money he was on right in his current contract, I think his current contract was pretty fair. He wasn't being paid like a top tight end in the league, because he's not. He's a guy who brings some skills to the table. I mean, look, he was better than Ryan Griffin. That's what I'll say. I'd certainly take Tyler Conklin over Ryan Griffin. So you pay a little premium for that. But I think that some teams there are teams out there that are always trying to make a splash. I think some teams will look at his stats the last 3 years and probably give him more money than he deserves, because, Conklin's not a guy who you run your passing game through. He's not really a second guy. I'm not even sure he's a third option. I think he's a guy who's really more of a depth player in your passing game, and he doesn't add a whole lot as a blocker. Now, the challenge for the Jets is that there's no obvious replacement on the roster. I mean, Jeremy Ruckert has not shown any sort of capability to play effectively at the NFL level. It's been frustrating because, I know Jeremy Ruckert can be better than what we've seen from him. I mean, the reason he got drafted is he could catch the ball. And with the Jets, I mean, I don't know if something's gotten into his head. Maybe a new coaching staff will help with this, but it's just like he can't do basic things. He can't run basic routes. He can't catch the ball the way he did in college. Ruckert's also not much of a blocker. I mean, for all the hype Ruckert got as a blocker coming out of Ohio State, there were some highlight reel blocks, but he was inconsistent. His technique was very inconsistent and needed to be refined. And I think you could say 3 years into his NFL career, it's very similar. Ruckert has some blocks on highlight reels. If he actually gets onto a guy and actually is able to drive him, there are some very impressive blocks on film. But on a play-to-play basis, he's not that impressive. And, where else could you go? Could you go with Kenny Yeboah? I mean, I don't really know that Kenny Yeboah is bringing a whole lot to the table. So, I don't know how much he would help you. Jets may need to go outside the organization to find somebody. And, of course, there are going to be rumors about maybe do the Jets take Tyler Warren out of Penn State in the first round. I've been pretty clear on that I don't think that would be the greatest idea in the world. But, there's a lot to look for. And I think really what you're looking for the Jets is I think Conklin's going to get a raise somewhere. That's my guess, is that some team's going to give Conklin a big contract. What you want to do, you want to find the next guy that was where Conklin was 3 years ago. Because 3 years ago, Conklin was with Minnesota. He was coming off a season where he was started as the backup. Then he kind of stepped into a starting role because of an injury. Had a good year. And the Jets were able to get him on a pretty moderate contract. Now, look, in an ideal world, I'd like somebody better than Conklin as the tight end. But you're kind of looking for the next rising guy. Next guy who's, getting his second contract, guy who's showing that he's ascending. Preferably somebody in their mid-20s who maybe doesn't have a track record that demands a huge salary, but a track record where you see that, he's improving. He's consistently improved during his time in the NFL. So, I think that's really the direction the Jets should look to go in at the tight end position. Look, if we're being honest, the tight end position is not that important unless you have one of the truly elite tight ends in the league. Now, if you have a guy who's a true mismatch, that's a different story. If you have somebody who linebackers can't cover, but too big to cover with a corner, that's a different story. But there are only a handful of guys like that in the league. Generally speaking, once you get past this, the top 5 or 6 tight ends, I think guys probably tight end 7 through 34 is more or less interchangeable. These are guys who don't really move the needle all that much, but guys who don't really hurt you, that don't really hurt you either. And that's probably where the Jets will end up at this position. I think it's not going to be popular to let Conklin go, but again, the Jets have to have priorities here. This is, they have $52 million and an awful lot of holes to fill. And there are holes that are more important than the tight end position this offseason. So Jets will have to, figure this out. But, it sounds like Tyler Conklin's brief career with the Jets is over. And, also I think, Tanner Engstrand on offense, the offensive coordinator, might want somebody who's a little bit better rounded at the tight end position, because Conklin's not much of a blocker. So maybe the Jets want to find a bit of a more complete player, as they move into this new offensive system. So we'll see. I mean, look, there's always a possibility the market isn't what Conklin's expecting or what I'm expecting or what the Jets are expecting. We've seen that through the years. There have been moments where there's been talk that the Jets aren't bringing a guy back, and then the market falls out for him, and the Jets get him back on a 1-year contract. That happened a few years ago with the center Connor McGovern. It actually happened this past offseason with Ashton Davis, where Davis thought, Davis didn't sound like Davis and the Jets were interested in a reunion because Davis wanted a lot of money, and the Jets didn't want to pay him much. And then Davis found out there wasn't a very robust market for him. I am expecting there to be a decent market for Tyler Conklin, but I guess you can't rule anything out if the market's not what he and the Jets are expecting. But it does sound like Tyler Conklin's going to move on. His 3-year Jets career likely to come to an end, and the Jets will need to find somebody new to play the tight end position. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast for us, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody, and send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we will do our weekly mailbag show.